My life was a collection of carefully curated routines, each one a brick in the wall I had built around myself. I woke at 6:30. I drank exactly 1 cup of black coffee at home while checking emails. At 8:15, I walked the 7 blocks to Groundwork, the coffee shop that served as my unofficial office. I ordered a large Americano and a croissant I never finished. I sat at the small, 2-person table in the corner by the window, the one with the wobbly leg I knew how to brace with my knee. And from 8:30 until his shift ended at 3, I would pretend to work while I mostly just watched Leo. Leo was the antithesis of my life. He was not a routine. He was a series of beautiful, unpredictable moments. He was the confident line of his shoulders under a plain gray t-shirt, the constellation of tattoos that disappeared under his short sleeves, the way he'd bite his lower lip when concentrating on a particularly intricate bit of latte art. He was the low, rumbling laugh that could cut through the morning rush, and the easy way he had with everyone, from the harried mothers to the old men who nursed their coffees for hours. I had convinced myself he was straight. It was a necessary defense mechanism. I'd heard him mention a movie date once, heard him compliment a woman's perfume. It was flimsy evidence, built on assumption and fear, but it was enough to keep my hopeless crush contained within the safe, silent confines of my own mind. My longing for him was just another part of the routine, as familiar and unchanging as the wobbly table leg. It was a dull, constant ache I had learned to live with. I was a graphic designer, a job that suited my preference for communicating through images rather than words, for existing behind a screen. My clients were remote, my interactions digital. Leo was the most consistent human contact I had, and he didn't even know it. To him, I was just the quiet guy in the corner. The usual, "Julian," he'd ask, and the simple act of him knowing my name and my order was enough to sustain me for the day. My heart would perform a pathetic little flip, a flutter of wings against the cage of my ribs, and I would nod, unable to manage more than a quiet, "Yeah, thanks, Leo." Then I would retreat to my corner and watch him move through the world with a grace and confidence I could only dream of. This particular Tuesday started like any other. The air was thick and heavy, the sky a bruised purple that promised a storm. The weather alerts had been buzzing on my phone all morning, warning of torrential rain and high winds. I ignored them. I had a deadline for a new web layout, and the oppressive atmosphere outside was a perfect match for my mood. I settled into my usual spot, the familiar scent of roasting coffee beans and steamed milk a comforting balm. Leo was there, a splash of vibrant life against the muted tones of the day. He was wearing a dark green shirt that made the amber in his eyes seem to glow. He caught my eye as I sat down and gave me a small, lopsided smile that did absurd things to my nervous system. I quickly looked down at my laptop, my cheeks burning. Routine. Safe. The day wore on, the sky growing darker. The first drops of rain began to fall around noon, fat and lazy. By 2, it was a deluge. The wind howled, rattling the large plate glass window beside me. The street outside became a river. Most of the customers had fled, leaving only a handful of us diehards. I was so engrossed in aligning a particularly stubborn block of code that I didn't notice when the last of the other patrons left. I didn't notice when Leo's coworker, a college student named Maria, bundled up and made a run for it. I only looked up when the overhead lights flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the cafe into a sudden, disorienting twilight. The only light came from my laptop screen and the emergency exit sign above the back door, which cast a sickly green glow. The hum of the refrigerators, the whir of the espresso machine, the quiet indie music, it all went silent. The only sound was the furious drumming of rain on the roof and the howl of the wind. My deadline. My meticulously planned afternoon. It all evaporated in an instant. I looked up towards the counter, and in the gloom, I could just make out Leo's silhouette. He was standing perfectly still, his hands resting on the counter. Well, his voice cut through the darkness, calm and even, with a hint of amusement. That's not ideal. That was the catalyst. Not the storm itself, but the sudden, enforced isolation. The world outside had ceased to exist. The routines were broken. The walls were down. It was just me and him, 2 figures suspended in the gray, watery light of a dying afternoon. My heart began to pound, a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. This was not part of the plan. This was not safe. I watched him, my breath held tight in my chest. He moved from behind the counter, his steps sure and unhurried in the near darkness. He wasn't using a phone for light. He knew the space by heart. I could hear the soft scuff of his boots on the wooden floor. He walked over to the front door, peering out through the glass at the maelstrom outside. The streetlights were out. The world was a churning mess of wind and water. He stood there for a long moment, a solid, reassuring presence against the chaos. "Looks like we're not going anywhere for a while," he said, his back still to me. His voice was lower now, more intimate in the charged silence of the room. It didn't feel like a barista talking to a customer. It felt like one person talking to another, stranded together. My own voice, when I finally found it, was a reedy thing. "Yeah, looks that way." He turned from the door, and even in the dim light, I could see the ghost of that lopsided smile on his face. It wasn't the practiced, customer service smile. This one was different. It was smaller, more genuine. It reached his eyes. "You're Julian, right? The designer." He knew what I did. I had never told him. I must have left my business card on the table once, or he'd overheard me on a call. The thought that he had filed away this piece of information about me, the quiet guy in the corner, sent a fresh wave of heat through my chest. "Yeah, that's me. Leo," he said, as if I didn't know, as if I hadn't been whispering his name in my head for the better part of a year. He walked towards my table, his movements fluid and easy. He didn't stop at a polite distance. He came right up to the edge of the table and leaned against it, crossing his arms over his chest. The proximity was dizzying. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his soap mixed with the ever-present aroma of coffee that clung to him. It was a scent I had tried to imagine 1,000 times, and the reality of it was overwhelming. "So, Julian the designer," he said, his voice a low murmur. "What's so important on that screen that you'd risk getting washed away in a biblical flood?" The question was teasing, light, but his gaze was not. It was direct and intense, and I felt pinned by it. I felt seen, truly seen, for the first time. The man I had observed from a safe distance for months was now right here, his attention focused solely on me. My carefully constructed world, with its one-way mirrors and silent observations, was shattering. I stammered, trying to explain the deadline, the client, the importance of it all, but the words felt flimsy and ridiculous in the face of the raging storm and his unwavering stare. It's just a project. For a client in California. They don't know it's storming here." He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "Right. The world keeps turning." There was a strange weight to his words. He pushed off the table and disappeared into the darkness behind the counter. I heard the clink of ceramic, the scrape of a metal tin. A moment later, a tiny flame flickered to life, and then another. He was lighting the small tea candles that usually sat in the center of each table. He placed one on the counter, then picked up another and brought it over to my table. He set the candle down between us. The small, dancing flame cast flickering shadows across his face, carving out the sharp line of his jaw and the gentle curve of his lips. The amber in his eyes seemed to catch the light and burn with a fire of its own. He pulled out the chair opposite me, the one I always pushed aside, and sat down. The wobbly table separated us, but it felt more like a bridge than a barrier. "Better," he said softly. I could only nod, my throat thick. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the storm outside and the frantic beating of my own heart. I kept my eyes fixed on the candle flame, afraid that if I looked at him, he would see everything I had worked so hard to hide. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with 1,000 unspoken things, a tension that was as palpable as the humidity in the air. This was the beginning of the observation phase shifting, becoming a two-way street. I was no longer the sole observer. I was being observed right back. And the feeling was terrifying and exhilarating and utterly new. My laptop screen, with its cold, blue light and its meaningless lines of code, seemed like an artifact from another life. I closed it slowly. The click of the lid was unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Now there was just the candlelight, the storm, and him. I risked a glance. He was watching me, his expression unreadable, his head tilted slightly. He wasn't smiling anymore. He just looked, and I had the distinct, unnerving feeling that he could see right through me. He saw the loneliness, the yearning, the pathetic, secret adoration. To fill the silence, I asked a stupid question. "Do you have to stay here?" Through all this, he finally looked away, his gaze drifting towards the rain-streaked window. Company policy. If you're here at closing and there's a weather event, you lock up and wait it out. Insurance thing, he shrugged, a simple movement of his broad shoulders that I felt in my gut. Besides, my apartment's a 20-minute walk. I'd probably get swept into a storm drain. He looked back at me. What about you? You live far. 7 blocks. I admitted, feeling foolish. 7 blocks is a long way in this, he said, his voice gentle. There was no judgment in it, just a statement of fact. His acceptance of my presence, his lack of annoyance at being stuck with me, was a small kindness that felt enormous. I was used to feeling like an imposition, a background character in other people's lives. But here, in the dark, I was half of the entire population. My presence mattered. He started talking, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm. He told me about growing up in a small town upstate, about the ridiculousness of some of his customers, about the time a squirrel got into the shop and he had to chase it out with a broom. The stories were simple, mundane, but I clung to every word. He was filling in the outlines of the man I had created in my head, adding color and texture and depth. I found myself relaxing, the knot of anxiety in my stomach slowly unspooling. I even managed to tell him a little about my work, about the strange requests of clients and the satisfaction of seeing a design come to life. As we talked, his hand, which had been resting on the table, crept closer to the center. My own hand was lying just inches away. I was acutely aware of the space between us, a no-man's land of tabletop that felt charged with electricity. I imagined closing that gap, my fingers brushing against his. The thought was so powerful, so terrifyingly bold, that I had to curl my hand into a fist and place it in my lap. I was analyzing everything. The way his voice softened when he talked about his sister. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he described the squirrel incident. The way he leaned forward slightly when I was speaking, a nonverbal cue that he was actually listening, that my words had value. Every micro-expression, every shift in his posture, was a clue I was desperately trying to decipher. Was this just how he was? Friendly, open, kind to the weird, quiet guy he was trapped with? Or was it something more? My mind, a relentless engine of overthinking, spun in circles, chasing its own tail. Then came the touch. It was so small, so fleeting, it might not have happened at all. He was gesturing with his hand as he spoke, emphasizing a point about the best way to roast coffee beans. On the downswing of his gesture, the backs of his fingers brushed against the back of my hand, which I had foolishly returned to the table. It was like a jolt of lightning, a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The contact lasted for less than a second, but it seared itself into my skin. He didn't pull back immediately. His fingers lingered for a fraction of a moment, a whisper of warmth and calloused skin against mine, before he continued his gesture as if nothing had happened. He didn't break his story. He didn't acknowledge it. But I saw it. A tiny flicker in his eyes. A momentary pause in his speech, so brief it was almost imperceptible. He had felt it too. I was sure of it. Or was I just projecting my own desperate hope onto an accidental movement? My internal monologue went into overdrive. It was an accident. He was talking with his hands. Don't be an idiot. But he paused. He looked right at you. He knows. He has to know. He knows you're staring at him all day. He probably thinks you're a creep. Or maybe he did it on purpose. My entire world narrowed to that single point of contact. The memory of the warmth of his skin was a brand on my hand. I couldn't hear what he was saying anymore. The sound of his voice was just a low hum beneath the roaring in my ears. I felt exposed, my secret crush laid bare on the table between us. I wanted to run, to disappear, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped by the storm, by the dark, by the terrifying, wonderful proximity of him. The hours blurred together, marked only by the guttering of one candle and the lighting of another. We fell into a comfortable rhythm. We talked. We lapsed into long, quiet spells. The silences were no longer awkward. They were companionable, filled with the steady presence of another person. The shared experience of being trapped, of the world being reduced to this one small, candlelit room, had broken down the formal barriers of our barista-customer relationship. We were just two people, Julian and Leo. He got up at one point and rummaged behind the counter again. He came back with 2 mugs and the croissant I had bought that morning and left on my table, untouched. You never eat these, he said, his voice soft. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. Thought you might be hungry now. He broke the croissant in half and pushed one half towards me. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt profoundly intimate. He noticed. He noticed my habits, my quirks. He paid attention. I took the piece of pastry, my fingers brushing his for a second time. This time, I was ready for it. The jolt was still there, but it was followed by a wave of warmth that spread through my chest. I looked up and met his eyes over the flickering flame. And in that moment, I saw something in their amber depths that wasn't just friendliness. It was something softer, something more vulnerable. Do you ever get lonely, Julian? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question was a quiet torpedo that blew a hole right through my carefully constructed defenses. It was too direct, too perceptive. No one ever asked me that. People saw my solitude and assumed it was a choice, a preference. They didn't see the yearning behind it. I couldn't lie to him. Not here, not now. I looked down at the table, at the pastry in my hand. Yeah, I breathed. Sometimes. Me too, he said, just as quietly. That admission stunned me. Leo? Confident, charming Leo, who was a friend to the entire neighborhood, who seemed to move through life collecting smiles and friendly conversations. The idea that he could feel the same gnawing loneliness that I did seemed impossible. It humanized him in a way my secret worship never could. He wasn't just an object of my affection anymore. He was a person, with his own vulnerabilities, his own quiet aches. He didn't elaborate. He just let the confession hang in the air between us, a fragile, shimmering thing. He had offered me a glimpse behind his own wall, a moment of genuine softness that invited me to do the same. This was the breakthrough. The moment the dynamic shifted from observation and tension to a shared, fragile vulnerability. We ate the croissant in silence, the simple act of sharing food in the dark feeling almost sacred. Later, he disappeared into the back room and returned with 2 thick, wool blankets from an emergency kit. He handed one to me. It was scratchy and smelled of cedar. It's getting cold, he said. I had been so consumed by my internal turmoil that I hadn't even noticed the drop in temperature. I wrapped the blanket around my shoulders, grateful for the warmth. He didn't go back to the other side of the room. He dragged one of the comfortable armchairs from the reading nook and placed it near my table, angling it towards the window. He settled into it, pulling his own blanket around him. We sat like that for a while, 2 solitary figures wrapped in wool, watching the rain lash against the glass, the faint candlelight dancing between us. The storm raged on, a wild, elemental thing. But inside our little ark, a strange peace had settled. The fear and anxiety that had been churning in my gut had subsided, replaced by a quiet sense of wonder. I felt more connected to another human being in that dark, powerless cafe than I had in years. The pretense was gone. There was no need for my usual social armor, no pressure to be anyone other than who I was. And he seemed to be okay with that. More than okay. Hours must have passed. My body was exhausted, but my mind was wide awake, buzzing with a nervous energy. I watched Leo as he stared out the window. The candlelight threw his profile into sharp relief. I could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the gentle slope of his nose, the impossibly long line of his eyelashes. He looked pensive, his thoughts a million miles away. I wondered what he was thinking about. Was he thinking about his own loneliness? Was he thinking about me at all? The storm began to lose its fury, the wind dying down to a mournful sigh, the rain softening to a steady, rhythmic drumming. The world outside was still dark and wet, but the violence had passed. It left behind a profound quiet, a sense of stillness and exhaustion. Leo stirred in his chair, stretching his long limbs. He stood up and walked back to the front door. He stood there for a moment, his hand on the handle, as if testing it. Then he turned. He looked across the dark room at me, a silhouette against the watery gray light filtering through the glass. He walked deliberately back towards the counter, but he didn't stop there. He walked to the door that led to the back room and the small office. And then he did something that made my heart stop. He walked back to the front door. I heard a sound that echoed in the cavernous silence of the room. A solid, metallic click. He had slid the deadbolt. He turned around slowly. His face was in shadow, impossible to read. He took a few steps towards me, stopping in the middle of the room. The space between us felt vast, and yet incredibly small. My breath was trapped in my lungs. My mind was a blank slate, wiped clean of all thought. There was only the sound of the rain, the scent of coffee and wax, and the sight of him, standing there in the dark. Then he spoke, and his voice was a low, rough thing that seemed to vibrate in the very air around me. Just us. Those two words. They landed in the quiet room like stones dropped into a still pond, the ripples spreading out to touch every corner of my being. Just us. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a simple observation. It was a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. The world was locked out. The rules of the day were suspended. Everything that had happened before this moment, the years of silent observation, the hours of tense, candlelit conversation, had led to this. The tipping point. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only stare at him, a dark, solid shape in the gloom, his presence filling the entire room. What did he mean? What did he want? My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. He was just securing the shop for the night. It was a safety precaution. He was just stating the obvious. But the way he said it, the low, deliberate timbre of his voice, belied any simple explanation. It was loaded with a weight I could feel in my bones. He took another step closer, and then another. He stopped just a few feet away from my table. I was still huddled in my chair, the wool blanket clutched around me like a shield. I felt small and exposed under his unseen gaze. "Are you scared, Julian?" he asked, his voice still that low, quiet rumble. Was I scared? I was terrified, but not of him. I was scared of the hope that was blooming, wild and reckless, in my chest. I was scared of what I wanted to happen next. I was scared that I had completely misread everything, that this was all some colossal misunderstanding that would end in my utter humiliation. "No," I managed to whisper, the word thin and unconvincing. A faint smile touched his lips, a brief flash of white in the darkness. "You're a bad liar." He moved again, circling the table, his steps slow and measured. He didn't sit in the chair opposite me this time. He came to stand beside my chair, so close I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I had to crane my neck to look up at him. He was an intimidating tower of shadow above me. "You watch me," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was another statement of fact. "Every day, you sit in this corner, and you watch me." The blood drained from my face. It was out. The one thing I thought I had kept so carefully hidden. He knew. He had known all along. Humiliation washed over me, hot and sickening. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. I squeezed my eyes shut, unable to bear the thought of what he must think of me. The creepy, quiet guy in the corner. "Hey," his voice was softer now, closer. I felt a light pressure on my shoulder. His hand, his large, warm hand rested on my shoulder, his thumb stroking the rough wool of the blanket. The touch was gentle, reassuring. It was not the touch of someone who was disgusted or angry. I opened my eyes. He had crouched down beside my chair, bringing himself to my level. His face was inches from mine, illuminated by the single, flickering candle on the table. I could see every detail now. The concern in his eyes, the slight furrow of his brow, the way his lips were parted just enough for me to see the ghost of his breath in the cool air. "Look at me, Julian," he said softly. I did. I held his gaze, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Why do you watch me?" This was it. The loaded question. The confrontation I had spent years dreading and, on some deep, secret level, craving. The subtext of the entire evening had just become the text. There was no more hiding. There was no more pretending. The truth felt like it was lodged in my throat, a hard, painful knot. I couldn't speak it. I couldn't give voice to the years of longing, the depth of my foolish, hopeless crush. The words wouldn't come. So I just looked at him, my eyes pleading with him to understand what I couldn't say. All my fear, all my yearning, all my pathetic adoration, I poured it all into that one, desperate look. He held my gaze for a long, breathless moment. His eyes searched mine, and I felt as though he were peeling back every layer of my defenses, looking directly into my soul. A flicker of understanding, of recognition, dawned in his expression. His own gaze softened, the intensity replaced by a profound tenderness that made my throat ache. His thumb moved from my shoulder, tracing a slow, deliberate path up the side of my neck, his calloused skin a feather-light touch against my own. He cupped my jaw, his hand warm and steady. My entire body went rigid, every nerve ending firing at once. He was so close. I could feel his breath on my lips, warm and smelling of coffee. Is it because, he whispered, his voice a rough, husky thing? You see the same thing I do. I didn't know what he meant, but I nodded anyway, a tiny, jerky movement. Yes. Whatever it was, yes. And then he closed the small distance between us. The breaking point wasn't a shout, it was a whisper. It wasn't a crash of lightning. It was the soft press of his lips against mine. It was hesitant at first, a question. His lips were soft, warm, and they tasted faintly of coffee and something else, something uniquely him. My mind went completely blank. All the analysis, all the overthinking, all the fear, it vanished. There was only this. The unbelievable reality of Leo kissing me. I was frozen for a second, my body locked in shock. He started to pull away, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. And that was what did it. The thought of him thinking I didn't want this, that he had made a mistake, was unbearable. I surged forward, my hand coming up to tangle in the fabric of his shirt, pulling him back to me. The second kiss was different. It was not a question. It was an answer. It was desperate and needy and filled with all the unspoken words, all the stolen glances, all the pent-up longing of the past year. I poured everything into it, and to my astonishment, he met me with an equal, startling intensity. His other hand came up to cradle the back of my head, his fingers threading through my hair, holding me to him as if he were afraid I might disappear. It wasn't rushed, but it was deep. It was a conversation our bodies were having because our voices had failed. It was a discovery, learning the shape of his mouth, the faint scratch of his stubble against my skin, the low groan that rumbled in his chest when I opened my mouth to him. The world outside, the storm, the coffee shop, it all melted away until there was nothing but the two of us in the flickering candlelight. This was the consummation of feeling, a moment so potent and real it made everything that came before it feel like a dream. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other. His eyes were closed. I kept mine open, memorizing the shape of his face in the warm, dancing light, trying to burn this moment into my memory forever. He felt real, solid. His hand was still tangled in my hair, his thumb stroking my scalp in a slow, soothing rhythm. Julian, he breathed, my name a prayer on his lips. I couldn't form a coherent response. I just made a sound, a little noise of contentment and disbelief deep in my throat. He opened his eyes, and the amber depths were dark and swirling with emotion. I thought I was going crazy, he said, his voice raw. I'd see you in that corner every day, with your laptop and your sad croissant, and I wanted to know what was going on in your head. I wanted to be the one to make you look up from that screen and smile. A real smile. Not that polite little nod you do. My heart swelled with a feeling so big it was painful. He had been watching me, too. He had been thinking about me. The entire narrative I had constructed in my head, the one where I was an invisible, pathetic admirer and he was the unattainable, straight object of my affection, was a complete fiction. We had been caught in the same orbit, two lonely stars circling each other, too afraid to bridge the distance. I thought you were straight, I confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush. A low, huffing laugh escaped him. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look at me properly, a genuine, dazzling smile spreading across his face. It was the smile I had been waiting a year to see up close. Did you? What on earth gave you that idea? You mentioned a movie date once. I mumbled, feeling my cheeks flush. And you complimented Sarah from the bookstore on her perfume. He threw his head back and laughed, a real, unrestrained sound that was music in the quiet room. The movie date was with my sister. She was going through a bad breakup. And Sarah's perfume? She wears the same one my mom used to wear. It caught me off guard. He shook his head, his smile softening into something tender. Julian, I haven't been on a real date in over a year because my brain has been completely occupied by the quiet, intense designer who hides in my coffee shop. My world tilted on its axis. He laced his fingers with mine, our hands resting on the arm of the chair. His grip was firm, solid, a tangible link. It's always been just us in here, for me, he said, his voice dropping to that intimate whisper again. You just didn't know it. We stayed like that for a long time, talking in low murmurs as the candle burned down, our fingers intertwined. He told me about the first time he really noticed me, how he'd tried to catch my eye, how he'd started making latte art on my Americanos, a drink that shouldn't have latte art, just hoping I would look up and comment. I told him about my loneliness, about the routines I built as armor, about how watching him was the brightest part of my day. It was a flood of confessions, a torrent of vulnerability that was both terrifying and liberating. Eventually, the exhaustion of the day and the emotional upheaval caught up with us. Yawning, Leo stood up, pulling me with him. "Come on," he said, his hand still holding mine. "You can't sleep in that chair." He led me to the reading nook, where a worn, comfortable-looking sofa was tucked against the wall. He tugged me down onto it, and we lay facing each other, the two wool blankets tangled around us. He didn't let go of my hand. In the near-total darkness, with only the faintest gray light from the window, I listened to the sound of his steady breathing, a counterpoint to the soft drumming of the rain. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel alone. I felt like I'd come home. I fell asleep with his thumb stroking the back of my hand, a small, repetitive gesture that felt like a promise. I woke to the unfamiliar sensation of sunlight on my face. It was warm and bright, a stark contrast to the darkness of the night before. I blinked, disoriented, my mind slowly piecing together where I was. The sofa, the coffee shop, Leo. I turned my head, and my heart sank. The space beside me was empty. He was gone. A cold, familiar dread washed over me. The morning after unease. The magical, candlelit world we had created was gone, vanished with the storm. In the harsh light of day, it all seemed impossible, like a fever dream. Maybe he woke up and regretted it. Maybe he saw me in the daylight and realized what a mistake he'd made. The old anxieties, the ones I thought had been vanquished, came roaring back to life. I sat up, the wool blanket pooling in my lap. The shop was eerily quiet. The power was back on. I could hear the low hum of the refrigerators. The room looked so different now. It was just a coffee shop again, familiar and mundane. The chairs were still out of place, the spent candles sitting on the tables like little monuments to the night before. It felt like walking onto a stage after the play has ended. I saw him then. He was behind the counter, his back to me. He was moving with his usual economy of motion, but something was different. His shoulders were tense. He didn't look relaxed and confident. He looked awkward. He hadn't said a word. He hadn't even looked at me. We were avoiding eye contact, two strangers in a room that felt suddenly too big. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. My carefully constructed hope from the night before began to crumble into dust. I needed to leave. I couldn't stay here in this awful, awkward silence. I stood up, my legs unsteady. I folded the blanket and placed it carefully on the sofa. I walked over to my table, my boots echoing on the floor. My laptop was still there. I packed it into my bag, my movements stiff and clumsy. I had to get out before he could say the words I was dreading. "Look, about last night." I slung my bag over my shoulder and walked towards the door, my gaze fixed on the floor. I didn't want to look at him. I couldn't bear to see the pity or regret in his eyes. I was almost at the door when his voice stopped me. "Julian." I froze, my hand on the doorknob. I slowly turned to face him. He was still behind the counter, holding two coffee mugs. He looked just as nervous as I felt. He wouldn't quite meet my eyes. "You're leaving without your coffee," he said, his voice quiet. It was such a normal, mundane thing to say. It felt absurd after the intensity of the night. It was a lifeline back to our old routine, and the thought was devastating. So we were just going to pretend it never happened. He was the barista, I was the customer. The kiss, the confessions, the shared blankets. It was all just a storm-induced hallucination. A bitter, painful lump formed in my throat. I tried to force a smile, to play along. "I should get going," I said, my voice strained. "Thanks for the shelter." It sounded lame, pathetic. He put the mugs down on the counter with a soft clink. He wiped his hands on a towel, a nervous, repetitive gesture. Then he took a deep breath and finally, looked at me. His eyes were wide, and I saw not regret, but a mirror of my own anxiety. He was just as scared as I was. He came out from behind the counter and walked slowly towards me, stopping a few feet away. The reassurance I so desperately needed was about to come, or my world was about to end. "Hey," he said, his voice low and serious. He gestured vaguely around the sunlit room. "This is weird. The light. Everything back to normal. He ran a hand through his already messy hair. I woke up and you were still asleep, and I panicked a little. I didn't know what the rules were now. The honesty of his admission disarmed me. The rules? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Yeah, the rules, he repeated, taking another step closer. Last night, in the dark, that was easy. There were no rules. It was just us. He looked into my eyes, his own gaze searching and vulnerable. But last night was real, Julian. For me. I don't want you to think it was just about the storm or being trapped. It wasn't. Relief washed over me so powerfully my knees felt weak. It was real. He felt it too. The sunlit awkwardness wasn't regret. It was fear. The same fear I had. The fear of navigating this new, fragile thing in the bright, unforgiving light of day. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It was real for me, too, I said, and my voice was steady for the first time that morning. A slow, beautiful smile spread across his face, the real one, the one that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. The tension in the room dissolved instantly. He closed the remaining distance between us and gently took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. The simple touch was an anchor, a confirmation. Good, he breathed. That's really good. He led me over to the counter and handed me one of the mugs. My usual, an Americano. But this time, on the dark surface, he had somehow managed to create a perfect, delicate foam heart. It was the most ridiculous, romantic thing I had ever seen. It's stupid, he mumbled, his cheeks coloring slightly. I know. No, I said, my voice thick with emotion. It's not. It's perfect. We stood there for a moment, sipping our coffee, our hands still linked. The test came sooner than I expected. We heard a key in the lock. The owner, a bustling woman named Carol, came in, her face a mask of concern. Leo, Julian, are you two all right? I was so worried. She took in the scene, the displaced furniture, the candles, the two of us standing a little too close together, our hands joined. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before her expression softened into a knowing, gentle smile. Well, looks like you two managed just fine. I felt my face heat up, and I instinctively started to pull my hand away, but Leo's grip tightened, holding me fast. He didn't let go. He just gave Carol a calm, easy smile. We're good, Carol. Just a long night. It was a subtle act of defiance, a public declaration. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't ashamed. He was holding my hand in the middle of the coffee shop in broad daylight. As Carol bustled around, starting the day's prep, a few of the other morning regulars started to arrive, peering in the windows. The world was coming back in. Our private bubble had burst. This was the real test. Could we exist out here? Leo seemed to sense my anxiety. He gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. I have to open up, he said quietly. But I don't want you to go. He pulled a pen from his pocket and grabbed a napkin. He scribbled something on it and folded it, pressing it into my palm. My number, he said. My shift ends at 3. Text me, please. The conscious choice. The deliberate step from a magical, isolated night into a real, potential future. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was a crumpled napkin with a series of numbers on it, but it felt more significant than any diamond ring. It was an invitation, an opportunity. I will, I promised, my voice firm. I didn't go back to my usual table. I couldn't. It felt like a relic of a past life. Instead, I took a seat at the counter, a place I had never been brave enough to sit before. I opened my laptop, but I didn't work. I just watched him. But it was different now. There was no more hiding, no more secret longing. Every so often, he would catch my eye as he worked, and he would give me that small, private smile, the one that was just for me. And I would smile back, a real smile. When 3 o'clock finally rolled around, I felt a nervous flutter in my stomach. I packed up my things as he was taking off his apron. He walked me to the door, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the street. I'll text you, I said. I'll be waiting, he replied. He hesitated for a second, then leaned in and gave me a quick, soft kiss, right there in the open doorway of the coffee shop. It was chaste and brief, but it was more daring than anything we had done in the dark. He pulled back, his eyes sparkling with a hint of mischief. See you later, Julian the designer. I walked home in a daze, the crumpled napkin clutched in my hand. The city was a mess, with downed branches and overflowing gutters, but I didn't notice. The world felt brand new, scrubbed clean by the storm, shimmering with possibility. My apartment, usually a refuge of quiet solitude, felt empty when I walked in. I missed his presence already. I didn't wait. I pulled out my phone and texted him. Hey, it's Julian the designer. I survived the 7-block journey home. His reply came almost instantly. Thank God. I was worried. My place. 7 p.m. I'm making dinner. I promise it's better than a day-old croissant. He sent an address. The evening was a blur of nervous anticipation. I showered, changed my clothes 3 times, and paced my apartment. At 6:45, I walked to his place, which was, to my surprise, only a few blocks from mine. We had been living in each other's orbits in more ways than one. His apartment was on the top floor of an old brownstone. It was small and cozy, filled with books and plants and the incredible smell of garlic and roasting chicken. It felt like him, lived in, warm, and welcoming. He greeted me at the door with a kiss that was slow and sure and left me breathless. We didn't talk about the storm or the coffee shop. We talked about books we loved, movies we hated, our families, our dreams. He wanted to open his own roastery one day. I wanted to illustrate a children's book. We ate dinner sitting on the floor of his living room, drinking cheap red wine out of mismatched glasses. It was simple, and it was perfect. The story ends not in a dramatic climax, but in a quiet, domestic moment the next morning. I woke up in his bed, the morning light filtering through his blinds. He was still asleep, his arm thrown protectively over my waist, his breathing a warm, steady puff against the back of my neck. I lay there for a long time, just feeling the weight of his arm, the warmth of his body next to mine. This felt more real, more profound, than even the most passionate kiss. This was the quiet intimacy of a shared life, a new beginning. He stirred, his grip tightening on me. Morning, he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. Morning, I whispered back. He pressed a sleepy kiss to my shoulder. You're still here, he said, a note of wonder in his voice. I'm still here, I confirmed. Later, we stood in his small kitchen, making breakfast together. He was making coffee, of course, and I was scrambling eggs. The room was filled with sunlight and the comfortable silence of 2 people who no longer needed words to understand each other. He came up behind me as I stood at the stove, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. I leaned back against him, the simple, solid feel of his chest against my back a profound comfort. I looked around his sun-drenched kitchen, at the easy way our bodies fit together, at the life humming along outside his window. My old life, the one of routine and observation and loneliness, felt like a story about someone else. The walls I had so carefully built had been washed away by a storm, and in their place, something new and hopeful was beginning to grow. I was no longer the quiet guy in the corner, watching the world from behind a screen. I was here. I was a part of it. I felt his lips press a soft kiss to the side of my neck. I closed my eyes, a real, genuine smile spreading across my face. I wasn't just watching anymore. I was home.